This used to be a thriving amusement park. Some of the old concrete midway is still here, along with a half-century of dirt and rotting branches. This was a busy time of the year, getting ready for the new season. The roller coaster and the fun house, they'd get fixed up. They'd dump tons of sand on the beach down at the lake. And this old picnic pavilion, well, it would get a fresh coat of paint. It was like that every spring. And while it was around, the park provided a lot of fun times and memories of children scrambling onto the rides or begging for some cotton candy. But behind the scenes, there were grown-ups running the place, and they too produced some fascinating stories. Welcome to Seances and Slot Machines, the story of Brady Lake Park.
The favorite haunt of the red man in the wilds of the primeval forest has become the favored resort of the civilized man, the Ravenna Republican.
Lake Brady is nestled in the rolling hills of northeast Ohio, southeast of Cleveland. It was named after Captain Samuel Brady, an 18th century frontiersman and Indian fighter. Over the years, Native Americans and early settlers fished in the lake and camped on its shores. After the Civil War, it became a popular picnicking site for local residents.
It would have been very, very rural. You would have had rolling hills. You would have had a few farmsteads. The lake setting without any development around it was probably very beautiful.
As the 19th century drew to a close, one man saw not just a scenic lake, but a commercial opportunity as well. A local merchant and hotel keeper, Alexander Kent, had already helped develop one amusement park at Geauga Lake in the 1880s. In 1890, he purchased Brady Lake and a whopping 150 acres, mostly around the east side. In early 1891, local newspapers announced Kent's intentions.
The finest resort in northeastern Ohio is to be made at Brady Lake. Mr. Kent has perfected plans which will transform this resort into a paradise for picnickers and those in search of recreation from the crowded cities. The Kent Courier.
This would not only be a place of relaxation and entertainment, but also a major economic boost for local business.
They saw an influx of people to the economy and new dollars in the economy.
Every week, there were stories in Kent and Ravenna papers about development of the new park. Trees were being cut down. Land was being cleared. 20 carpenters were hired to build an early roller coaster. A bathhouse was going up. A new steamboat for the lake was delivered. Cottages and campgrounds were put in place. It was a busy time. More importantly, a number of picnics were being scheduled for the summer season. Not just family outings of 10 to 15 people, but business and fraternal order picnics of 200, 500, or 1,000 people. They would be the lifeblood of the resort, indeed for all such parks for decades to come. As industrialization and immigration caused cities to balloon in the late 19th century, invention and mechanization also provided a little more leisure time and disposable income for Americans. Resorts and amusement parks promise beauty, relaxation, and thrills for a modest outlay.
Amusement parks provided respite from the hustle-bustle of the cities.
Some, like Lake Brady, saw themselves appealing to what they called the better class of society. People didn't just visit the park, they took excursions or enjoyed outings in the country. The early footprint of the resort was tiny. The initial facilities were sparse, yet sophisticated, and definitely not inexpensive. When Lake Brady Resort opened on June 11, 1891, visitors found an attractive, appealing facility. Next to the lake, there was a two-story pavilion, the top floor for dancing and the bottom floor for dining. There was a bathing beach and bathhouse, 40 rowboats, and a steamboat to provide leisurely trips around the lake. There were picnic tables, fishing, a baseball field, and tennis court. Local bands performed for concerts and dancing. And Kent added a miniature railroad and a steam riding gallery, an early version of a carousel that chugged and whirled to the sound of Calloway music and a steam compressor. The Piece de Resistance was a 400-foot-long switchback gravity railway, one of the earliest roller coasters. It rose 22 feet off the ground, provided a total ride of 800 feet, and rolled along at a stirring 6 miles an hour. There already was a fair amount of competition for the fledgling resort at Lake Brady. Buying and developing the park cost Kent a lot of money. The switchback railroad alone was $3,000. The lake steamer cost $2,000. Altogether, Kent claimed he invested $25,000 in Lake Brady Resort. Opening day was a huge success. Even though a drenching rainstorm swept through the area in the afternoon, undoubtedly holding down attendance, more than 2,000 people showed up.
The Lake Brady Resort was opened auspiciously and promises to be the most popular resort in this part of the state. The Kent Courier.
That first day, that first summer, was in fact a rousing success. So successful that someone already was interested in buying the resort. And Alexander Kent was willing to listen. Spiritualism was a movement, a philosophy, and a religion. Popular in the late 19th century, spiritualists believed in a oneness with nature, championed the rights of women and blacks, and believed in talking to and for the dead. The seance and the medium were at the center of their belief. Spiritualists often were chided, and spiritualism was not universally accepted by most people. Still, the movement had a strong following in Ohio. Many spiritualists wanted to create rural communities where they could live, hold encampments, speak on issues of the day, and conduct their seances and fortune-telling. In 1891, a group of spiritualists living near Manaway decided that Lake Brady Resort would be an excellent home for them. When they approached Kent about buying the resort after its highly successful debut in 1891, he said yes. The purchase price was set at $25,000. It would prove to be a strange marriage.
Actually, it was kind of a very unique combination of running an amusement park and running a church.
At first, visitors noticed little difference under spiritualist management. They built a 2-story hotel with a fine dining room. They constructed what would become a popular theater building. They enlarged the bathing beach. Fireworks on the lake and popular local bands became staples of the resort. In 1892, more than 100,000 people visited the park during its summer season, May to September. It was a very successful year. 1893 was equally good. The spiritualists brought in a new ride, a razzle-dazzle, just like the one at New York's popular Coney Island. 25 spins for a nickel. Beneath the surface success, however, there were problems. The spiritualists were seriously split on how to run the park and how it fit with the group's philosophies and objectives. The spiritualists also had added their own unique attractions to the park, and they were not shy about engaging park visitors in the beliefs of spiritualism. Seances were held regularly with different kinds of mediums: test mediums, trumpet mediums, chalk mediums, trance mediums, depending on how the dead communicated through the chosen person. Fortune tellers set up in the park. So did so-called spirit photographers. Instead of visiting the photo booth and paying a nickel for a few quick snapshots for the scrapbook, Resort goers were invited to have a photo taken wherein ghosts of relatives and friends could appear in the photos around the subject. This heavy dose of spiritualism did not go over well with most visitors. Thousands of potential visitors were abandoning Lake Brady.
I came across an item in the Kent Courier in 1895. Picnics are numerous on the Lake Brady grounds, and some of the picnickers have been very discourteous to the spiritualists. Fortune tellers and frauds, they sneeringly called them to their faces.
If the public was growing dissatisfied, so were some of the spiritualists. Internal bickering and public disenchantment were combining to put the future of the resort into serious question. Business operations began to suffer. By 1895, lawsuits were being filed against the spiritualists for unpaid bills. To try to add more stability, in 1896, Alfred Kellogg, a well-known, wealthy Cleveland spiritualist and businessman, put up his own money to buy partial ownership in the resort and to provide better management. It didn't help. The court finally ordered the resort, only 7 years old, put up for auction. Valued at $20,000, it brought less than $9,000 at the sale. At the turn of the century, Lake Brady Resort was in desperate straits. By 1899, some of the spiritualists had separated themselves from the park and started to do what they originally wanted to do. They began building a separate community north of the resort. Within a short time, there was an auditorium, a library, an amphitheater, and a growing number of cottages. In early 1900, the spiritualists who were still running the resort issued their last promotional brochure. To increase park income, they announced that for the first time since Lake Brady had been opened, there would be an admission charge, 10 cents.
We are sure our friends will not stay away on account of the small admission.
And the 1900 brochure, for one final time, tried to sell what spiritualists viewed as the double appeal of the park.
Having been visited by so many in former years and unanimously admitted by all to be a perfect paradise, Lake Brady needs no further description. Come and be convinced, and learn of the philosophy and proof of a life beyond the grave.
It was the same old pitch: walk in the woods, ride the roller coaster, dance in the ballroom, attend a seance. Instead of appealing to the audience, it demonstrated the incompatibility of the spiritualist business and religious philosophies.
It was impossible for spiritualists to separate their religion, which those were very deeply held beliefs, from the idea of running a business.
Almost a decade of spiritualist operation of the park finally came to an end in September 1900. The Akron Daily Democrat, tongue-in-cheek, announced, "The spirits no longer float about in the air." Alfred Kellogg, who still owned the resort, was fortunate that local businessmen realized the resort was still a strong economic asset. Tens of thousands of campers and picnickers could spend a lot of money on food, clothing, and supplies in local stores. Thus, a group of Kent businessmen approached Kellogg about buying the resort. He agreed and sold it for $20,000. By the time the 1902 season rolled around, the resort opened as the reinvented, entertainment-centered Brady Lake Electric Park. With the spiritualists out of the picture and some money to spend, the Electric Park Group installed scores of new electric lights to make the place both more attractive and safer at night. But the changes to the park were mostly cosmetic. On July 4th, more than 8,000 people attended the Akron Grocers Picnic, but other resorts and amusement parks in northern Ohio were bringing in new rides, more modern concessions, and better attractions. The 13-year-old park at Brady Lake was not keeping up. Electric Park lasted only a few years, but it recaptured some of the business and popularity lost during the spiritualist ownership. More importantly, it caught the attention and piqued the curiosity of another businessman and promoter, one who would lead the park for the next 20 years. Len Hartman was born in 1874 in Orrville, Ohio. From an early age, he loved the entertainment business. By his early 20s, he was producing, managing, and promoting stock theater companies and small circuses throughout the Midwest. Around 1904, he brought his theater group for a short booking at the Lake Brady Theater. Glenn Hartman fell in love with the place. In 1905, Hartman decided to settle down at Brady Lake. Hartman eventually not only became manager of the park, but he also owned stock in the new company. He bought a home adjacent to the resort and brought his wife up from Orrville. The new group launched an ambitious 3-year improvement plan. In 1907, they brought in an exciting and expensive figure-8 roller coaster to replace the outdated switchback railway. It was a wise move and a popular ride. The owners also built a new bathhouse with 100 rooms. The theater building was expanded to seat 800 people. Attendance at Lake Brady blossomed. The picnic grounds were booked for the season. For the next season, the group purchased a fancier merry-go-round, built a bowling alley and billiards hall next to the theater, and put up a huge new dining pavilion. They added a penny arcade and a photo gallery without spirit. The resort was moving closer to becoming a true amusement park. For the 1909 season, a more spacious and modern one-story dance hall replaced the old one. A dance instructor was brought in to give free lessons an hour before the orchestra started playing. If you knew how to dance, you were more likely to stick around and pay to dance when the band started. Henrique, an escape artist, packed them in with his death-defying act. On the 4th of July, 1909, 1,400 people went to the theater. 800 couples danced on the new floor, and the streetcar had 6,000 round-trip passengers. It was the largest crowd in the history of Lake Brady Resort. Hartman worked hard to keep the park from becoming stagnant. Against his better judgment, he opened the theater to vaudeville acts. By 1917, the theater had been fitted to show silent motion pictures, but only the highest grade. Bessie Barriscale starred in Not My Sister. Mae Marsh performed in A Child of the Paris Streets. Daily attendance at the park averaged around 1,500 people. On holidays and special promotion days, up to 8,000 visitors swarmed over the grounds. With all the cottages, camping areas, and expanding hotel, the summer population of the Brady Lake area sometimes swelled to 4,000 people, 10 times its normal size. Local businesses prospered. More than 75 people worked at the park, almost all local. Brady Lake Park was becoming almost like a small town, all to itself. It was secure and successful. Then the war came. American entrance into World War I in April 1917 put many resorts and amusement parks out of business. Transportation to parks was limited. Food supplies were cut back. Sugar was rationed. Coal was scarce. And thousands of young men went overseas to fight.
And we won't come back till it's over there.
While Lake Brady Resort escaped serious economic hardship, 2 of its competitors did not. By the end of the 1917 season, Silver Lake Park and Lakeside Park went out of business. Silver Lake was sold for $600,000 to real estate developers. Lake Brady's owners, who had controlled the park for 10 years, watched the park's income dip slightly as the U.S. entered the war. They saw Lakeside go out of business, and they surely knew about the large sum of money paid to buy Silver Lake. Which event concerned or enticed them more is not clear. but their interest in continuing to own Brady Lake began to wane. Local residents worried that the park would become a private club, or that it would be bulldozed for real estate development. Len Hartman also was concerned. He had brought the place not only back to health, but to a position of popularity and financial fitness. He was not going to give up his resort. So in early 1918, he and his brother-in-law bought the place, lock, stock, and carousel.
To D.G. Hartman and his brother-in-law, the public owes a debt of gratitude. They have saved this charming resort for the public, the closing of which would have been little short of a calamity. Kent Tribune, April 1918.
Hartman and Gardner bought the buildings, cottages, rides, and 165 acres of land, the whole valued at $150,000. And over the next few years, they spent even more money. A giant seaplane ride was added, 75 feet tall, with 3 planes. It had a 120-foot swing radius and cost $7,000. And there was more, a Ferris wheel, an upgraded bathhouse, a new parking garage for the growing number of automobiles, and another new dance floor. Hartman had a passion for the jazz and swing music so popular at the time. He booked some of the more popular bands in the country, the 7 musical Magpies, Hal White's Syncopators, and the Fletcher Henderson Orchestra. In 1921, undoubtedly much to his personal chagrin, Hartman tore down the old theater. In its place went a home for the latest huge profitable national pastime, roller skating. In 1923, the park netted $39,000, about $500,000 in today's money. He constantly promoted the beauty, healthfulness, and pure fun to be had at Brady Lake. And life was fun in the 1920s. American culture was experiencing a revolution. The economy was booming. The war was far back in the country's rear-view mirror. It was the Roaring '20s. It seemed to be a good time for Hartman's biggest venture. In 1924, Brady Lake Park encompassed 225 acres and was valued at $800,000. But it needed an infusion of new money to pay off old debts and to keep the park competitive. Hartman came up with a major campaign to raise $200,000 through the sale of gold bonds. They promoted the campaign hard and even developed a catchy slogan to appeal to budding capitalists. Brady Lake, a great place to play, a wonderful spot for profit. The early 20s were prosperous times, nationally and locally, yet Hartman found few investors interested in his bonds. Within a year, in 1925, the campaign was abandoned. Still in debt, Hartman was forced to bring in multiple new partners, mostly lawyers and real estate men from Ravenna. Beyond that, Hartman's connection to his beloved Brady Lake Park was about to end. He had been there for more than 20 years, when in 1927 his wife became seriously ill. She died in June. Within weeks, Hartman sold his shares in the park to his business partners and moved back to Orville. Flagging attendance at an amusement park normally meant the grounds were not kept up, the rides were in poor working condition, or a national calamity had drawn away public interest in dollars. None of those was true at Brady Lake Park in 1927. The problem had its roots in a Ravenna courtroom 2 years earlier. Henry Robeson, judge of the county probate court, usually handled cases involving estates, adoptions, and custody issues. In July 1925, however, he discovered he had the power to regulate public dance halls. Robeson had no problem with dances at amusement parks Monday through Saturday, but he drew the line at dancing on Sunday.
And in 1925, he basically decided, I'm not permitting Sunday dance licenses anywhere within my jurisdiction. And that, of course, impacted Brady Lake.
Sundays, however, were big money days at amusement parks, and dancing was a huge draw. Paying customers stayed away if they could not dance. Brady Lake Park suffered with the law in 1925 and again in 1926. By the spring of 1927, however, something had to be done to get the dancers and their money back in the park on Sundays. An obscure Ohio law at the time allowed incorporated cities and villages to be exempt from some local and state regulations. Thus developed one of the stranger political subterfuges. Brady Lake Park was in Franklin Township and subject to the laws of the township, the county, and the state. That included the no dancing order from Judge Robeson. So the answer was to secede from Franklin Township. Permanent residents in and around the park, mostly those areas hugging the lake on the east and south, decided to create their own municipality. On June 17, 1927, residents went to the polls, all 65 of them. They voted 64-1 to create Brady Lake Village. 2 weeks later, residents of the new village went to the polls again.
They organized the village and they elected a mayor and they seated a village council. And one of the first acts of the first mayor of Brady Lake was to issue a decree saying Sunday dancing is back on. And Judge Robeson couldn't do anything because he had no jurisdiction over a village.
2 weeks later, on a pleasant Sunday evening, some 2,000 dancers whirled around the floor. The park that day enjoyed a record attendance of 12,000 visitors. Park officials and residents might have thought they were solving their biggest problem in 1927 by instituting home rule. But in less than 15 years, the issue would be raised again. With Len Hartman no longer running the park, new leadership had to be found, quickly. It came from one of the men Hartman had taken in as a new partner. Don Wilson Sr. was a successful, well-connected real estate developer in Ravenna, and he loved spending his summers at what he called the lake, running the growing amusement park. Wilson shared a number of traits with Hartman. He believed in providing a large bang for the customer's buck. He loved jazz and big band music, and he was an unabashed promoter. Few celebrities could match the first big act he brought to the lake. In August 1926, a 20-year-old American had become the first woman to swim the English Channel.
Gertrude Ederle was in Brady Lake in 1927, and she swam the lake after she had swum the English Channel.
More than 20,000 people flocked to Brady Lake to see her swim around its shores in afternoon and evening performances. The next year, 1928, may have begun the greatest era in the park's history. The place blossomed into a full-scale amusement park, leaving its rustic roots in the dust. In that 1 year alone, Wilson and the other stockholders spent $200,000 for improvements. By the 1920s, no self-respecting amusement park was still featuring a primitive and tame figure-8 roller coaster. Brady Lake was. Most parks had moved up to the taller, multi-hill, speedy racers now associated with the golden age of coasters. Wilson went for the best. The cost was staggering for a park the size of Brady Lake, $60,000. But they got a beauty. Its total run was 2,400 feet, and it was 60 feet high at its peak. Its first breath-catching drop at the far north end of the park immediately barreled into a hard right turn, and then a rapid run down the entire length of the park. The Wildcat was tucked in behind the roller rink and the bowling alley buildings, snaking along the main road through the park, now the public thoroughfare called Lakeview Drive. Cottages on Lakeview once had enjoyed relatively quiet times, even when the park was in operation. With the arrival of the Wildcat, that luxury disappeared. Out your front window, across the street, maybe 60 feet from your porch, Wildcat roared and clattered by, the screams of its passengers rising and falling deep into the night. The Midway now extended far to the south, with new amusements and concessions for young and old. Cottages gave way to rides, souvenir stands, snapshot booths, and games of chance. Wilson continued booking some of the best-known big bands. Guy Lombardo packed the dance hall in 1928. Ben Burney and the immensely popular Ted Lewis and his musical Clowns played the park the next year. Then came Rudy Vallee, who drew 5,000 people for 2 shows at $1.50 a head. The park hosted the American Legion Drum and Bugle Corps competition. It held a rodeo and sponsored a horse race in the lake. Don Wilson loves special attractions and promotions. In early September of 1929, a few weeks after Ted Lewis packed a house at Brady Lake, prices on the New York Stock Exchange began to falter. The downward slide continued until October 29th, when the stock market crashed, plunging the United States and much of the world into a deep economic depression. Within a year, businesses were cutting back or failing. Personal income and profits were dropping. People were losing their jobs and their homes.
The Great Depression had a large effect on the history and success of amusement parks, and it was a negative force.
Of the 1,800 or so parks in the country in 1929, 400 remained by 1935. 4 years later, only 250 were left. Akron Summit Beach Park could not pay its bills and was auctioned off. The park somehow got through the Depression years, but it was not easy. There would be changes. In 1930, the old hotel, which had hosted President William McKinley and thousands of park visitors, was unceremoniously torn down. In 1932, the cash-strapped Northern Ohio Traction Company abandoned streetcar service to Brady Lake and just about everywhere else outside Akron. Now the park would rely heavily on the personal automobile, and during the Depression, there was not much gas for trips to the country. For opening day in May 1933, the park ran one of the few full-page newspaper ads in its history. Heavily illustrated, the ad played up all of the park's traditional strengths: thrilling rides, dancing, swimming, boating, a German beer garden, fishing, cottage. A beer garden? 1933 marked the end of the great American experiment in Prohibition. After 14 years, no legal beer, wine, or liquor, and the rise of one of the most daunting periods of criminal activity in the nation's history, the public said goodbye to Prohibition. Brady Lake visitors said hello to the new Hofbrau, advertised as a German-style beer garden. Customers could get their favorite brew, have a sandwich, and listen to an Papa band. And as the Great Depression showed signs of waning in 1937, Don Wilson found himself back at the helm of the lake. He picked up bringing in nationally known entertainers. The enormously popular Paul Whiteman and his 25-piece orchestra drew almost 2,000 people. A month later, Cab Calloway danced into the park, singing Minnie the Moocher to the delight of huge crowds.
Hey, folks, here's a story about Minnie the Moocher. She was a red-hot hoochie-coocher.
Some say Wilson even booked the tantalizing fan dancer of the time, the infamous Sally Rand. Wilson also upgraded the second most popular ride in the park, next to the roller coaster. He brought in a beautiful, high-quality, hand-carved merry-go-round. Children loved the colorful menagerie of 48 horses, lions, and zebras, and the music from the Wurlitzer organ. The carousel stayed at the park until it closed, eventually finding its way to Knott's Berry Farm in California, where it remains today. And that wasn't the last change. Americans love to gamble, always have, probably always will. Today there are legal casinos in major cities, state-run lotteries and video slot machines at racetracks, and it's all legal. 75 years ago, there also were lots of opportunities to take a crack at old lady luck, few of them legal. Card games, roulette wheels, lucky numbers, dog races, pinball machines, those were some of the games of chance. Bingo and slot machines were two others. The one-armed bandit was a mechanical marvel, a whirling dervish of fruits, geometric shapes, and numbers, all spun to life by the tug of a handle. By 1937, there were about 200 machines in the county, including at Brady Lake and Geauga Lake. Another seemingly less serious form of gambling was more recent and even more widespread.
And 36.
Bingo, by the 1930s, had become a perfect rage.
I-24.
It was played at women's clubs, society parties, fraternal organizations, and amusement parks. A Massillon, Ohio woman told a newspaper in 1938 that on a recent Sunday visit to Brady Lake Park, she watched 2,500 people playing bingo. And she was right. That summer, the park's dance hall had been repurposed into a huge bingo facility, aptly named Bingo Land. Some bingo games in the country were played for fun, some for charity. Winners got coffee pots or clocks. Brady Lake customers played for cash. On any given Saturday night, with 2,000 players, and even assuming liberal jackpots, the house could make well over $1,000, plus income from food and drink that customers bought. Add in the take from just 10 average nickel slot machines, and the haul for one Saturday night at Brady Lake could reach $1,500, about $25,000 today. Bingo Land was more profitable than the roller coaster and carousel combined, and cheaper to keep running. It was the spring of 1941. Workers were sprucing up the park for its annual Memorial Day opening. Rides and concessions along the midway each year were getting older and a bit harder to keep working properly. There didn't seem to be the same excitement for the coming season as there had been just a few years earlier, with good reason.
Remember that in these grave days in the affairs of the world, we need internal unity, national unity.
In late spring, as Brady Lake Park opened, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and Japan was plowing through Indochina. One by one, nations were forced into the conflict, and in December 1941, the Japanese attack on American forces at Pearl Harbor thrust the United States into the war as well. For many of the amusement parks that had survived the Depression, World War II would sound the death knell. That was not true for Brady Lake. Its life cycle was nearing an end, but it wouldn't be the war that put it out of business. Edward Kleinman was a refined, well-dressed, introspective family man and attorney living in a nice home in Cleveland Heights. In 1942, he had 3 young children and maintained a busy law practice. He had business interest in a vending machine firm, ice cream companies, restaurants, and a half-dozen real estate ventures around Cleveland. He loved boxing and supported the Golden Gloves. He also was the Cleveland mob's man at Brady Lake Park. During Prohibition, assorted criminal organizations fought for power, territory, and money. The so-called Cleveland Syndicate was one of them. It had its roots in a highly successful rum-running business between Canada and Cleveland in the 20s and 30s. After Prohibition, the syndicate focused on nightclubs, gambling, and bookmaking in counties outside Cleveland. In the spring of 1942, Billboard magazine carried a seemingly innocuous article reporting that Brady Lake Park had been sold for $29,000 to Cleveland Interest. The syndicate had found another business opportunity. It would be run by Edward Kleinman. The new owners spent $35,000 to fix up the park. Most of the money, however, went to revamp and greatly expand the old beer garden building.
Brady Lake Park, rebuilt and under new ownership, makes its 1942 bow May 28th. A marine room overlooking the lake is one of the new additions. It will offer floor shows. Billboard magazine.
The dining pavilion of 1928 had become the Hofbrau Beer Garden of 1933, had become the Marine Room nightclub of 1942. The grand opening of the Marine Room on May 28th was a smash hit. More than 2,000 people jammed the club to dance to the Manny Landers Orchestra and to be entertained by the Tip Top Girls and CBS radio star Beatrice Kay. Local politicians and other VIPs ate, drank, and rubbed elbows with Cleveland gangsters and mob lawyers. Residents were worried that Brady Lake Amusement Park would become a center for gambling. Kleinman tried to allay the concerns. He drew attention to the park, reaching out to workers at a nearby war facility. The massive Ravenna ordnance plant was now in place east of Ravenna, adding more than 20,000 workers and their families to Portage and adjacent counties. By June, just weeks after the grand opening, there were more than 80 slot machines at the park. Bingo was being offered more days and for much bigger cash jackpots, some as high as $1,000. All gambling operations eventually ended up in a greatly expanded marine room with a large neon sign on its roof. There was seating for at least 1,200 bingo players in one section and room for more than 200 slot machines in another. In October 1942, while the war raged across two oceans, Brady Lake Park was on its way to becoming what one newspaper called, and what local residents had feared, a gambling emporium.
Operators of the park made no secret of their bingo land, which is the name for the hall that houses the bingo games and slot machines. The slot machines do a thriving business. Sometimes the suckers stand 2 and 3 deep behind machines. Cleveland Plain Dealer, 1942.
For the first few years of the syndicate's ownership, local police and government officials paid little attention to gambling at the park or anywhere in the county.
The sheriff would give some lip service to it, and they would go out and do some gambling raids, and the gambling would go away for a while, and then it would come back.
A Plain Dealer reporter played the slots to see if he could win. He lost 30 nickels to the one-armed bandit in 15 minutes. The reporter said a village police officer at the park told him it isn't healthy to be coming out here worrying about what's going on. Then the mayor played the trump card. Brady Lake, he said, was an incorporated village. As such, it's immune to some laws, including those that ban bingo. The 1927 vote that had created the tiny municipality and saved Sunday dancing was now being used to protect gambling at the park. Lines soon were clearly drawn. The syndicate, park, and local government on one side, a growing number of state officials and local reformers on the other. The state took the offensive. The Highway Patrol and the Office of Price Administration in May 1943 blockaded roads leading into Brady Lake Park. They said they were checking to see if the drivers had the proper gas rationing stamps. More than 400 cars apparently headed to the park were stopped. Shortly afterward, the Portage County prosecutor ordered all slot machines removed from the county. The next morning, almost all slot machines had disappeared, including those at Brady Lake Park. A few weeks later, they were back. For most of 1943 and 1944, that was the cat and mouse game played in Brady Lake and throughout the state. The stakes in the game, though, were about to get much higher. Frank Lousy, former Cleveland judge and mayor, had long been a foe of crime, criminals, and gambling. In 1944, he ran a vigorous reform campaign to become governor of Ohio. When he won, he put the Cleveland Syndicate and Brady Lake Park squarely in his sights. Lousy was joined by local organizations and newspapers who railed against bingo, slots, bookie joints, and pinball machines. In August 1945, a reporter wrote a scathing expose on gambling in Portage County. It declared that slots and commercial bingo were rampant.
There were thousands of dollars going through Brady Lake between bingo and the slots, thousands of dollars every night.
Brady Lake Park, once known as Ohio's perfect playground, was labeled a notorious cheap spot. The day after the article appeared, slot machines disappeared in the county. A short time later, they were back. It was the cat and mouse game again, and Governor Lousy was having none of it. In April 1946, he ordered Brady Lake Mayor Joseph Cox to remove the slots and stop the bingo games. The mayor refused. In a stunning move, the governor removed Cox from office. Gambling at the park continued, even as the Cleveland Syndicate tried to make it appear that Brady Lake was returning to its roots as an amusement park. They promoted picnics and pony rides, built a fancy new entrance gate, and dumped more sand on the old beach. Post-war Americans in Northeast Ohio did show more interest in the park. Families spent a day or an evening walking the Midway, riding the aging roller coaster, or swimming in the increasingly dirty lake. Kids, after all, don't care about gambling. They wanted to ride the carousel, try to win a Cupid doll, eat a candy apple. Yet, for each happy memory created, another ride was removed, another attraction lost. It was the park's last stand. In 1948, a Portage County grand jury was asked to indict Kleinman on gambling charges. It refused, but the pressure from the governor and the new anti-gambling sheriff had taken its toll. When the park opened for the 1949 season, the slot machines were gone for good. Brady Lake operated through at least 1949, continuing to promote its bingo games. Newspaper ads for the park began to get smaller and appear less frequently. After Labor Day in 1949, no more appeared in newspapers, not in 1950, not in 1951, not ever. The last ad to appear in 1949 carried an ironic invitation. Plan your group picnic for next year at Brady Lake Park. From all appearances, there was no next year. The fact is, there is no record of when the park officially closed. Even older local residents disagree on the date and circumstances. One day, it just didn't open again, and hardly anyone noticed. The syndicate left, closed and locked the gates. They took almost nothing. Buildings, rides, concession, bingo tables were left behind. It was a freeze frame in time.
Everything just stood there for years. The buildings, the rides were still there, the roller coaster was still on the tracks. It was just like a ghost town.
Some folks swear that state officials came in with sledgehammers, smashed the slot machines, and heaved them into the lake. That would have been big news, but there are no articles in any area newspapers about that happening, and no one has claimed discovering scores of one-armed bandits in the shallows along the shore. Brady Lake Park just got old, unpopular, and unprofitable.
Everything after a while loses its luster. It's not as exciting. It's not as much fun. The phasing out of gambling, I think, was a real factor in it.
The Cleveland Syndicate moved on to much bigger things. As the pressure from the governor increased, the mob looked for friendlier territory again. They found it in 1949 in Las Vegas, where gambling was legal. The syndicate put millions of dollars into building the fabulous new Desert Inn in Vegas. Back in Brady Lake, the old park was left to make a profit off its remaining rides, concessions, and bingo games. It couldn't do it. In 1950, U.S. Senator Estes Kefauver convened his Rackets Committee to investigate organized crime in America. When witnesses talked about Ohio, Brady Lake Park was mentioned more than a few times in less than flattering testimony, and in the past tense. The next time the old park was mentioned in the papers was several years later, and then the articles dealt with the eyesore the now-defunct park had become.
Brady Lake is nothing more than a group of decaying buildings now, a ghost park. Akron Beacon-Journal, January 1953.
And it was literally disintegrating. Nature was eating away at the old park. It didn't take long for the weeds and untended shrubs to lay claim to the midway, or for sun, rain, and snow to fade signs and rot wooden structures. Some area residents also helped themselves to whatever was left behind. Even one of the beautiful carousel horses was removed as a souvenir and used as a backyard swing for a young girl, until it too surrendered to the elements. Although the gates and fences were closed and locked, there were gaps where local children could wiggle through and enjoy the delights of the skeleton that was left.
There was a break in the fence where we all could get in. It wasn't hard to get into, and so we had the full run of the park.
There was no power, but youngsters and teens pushed, pulled, and rode the old rides until they fell apart. No one was quite sure what to do with the place. The syndicate still owned the land and buildings. Eventually, in 1955, Kleinman asked Don Wilson, former owner and manager of the park, to sell or tear down some of the deteriorating buildings and rides, including the once proud Wildcat roller coaster.
It pretty much decayed piece by piece. A lot of it wasn't sold off. It's exposed to the elements. It just basically went away.
Yet, even by 1959, some dilapidated structures remained. Finally, the Brady Lake Fire Chief ordered them burned. The roller rink and a souvenir shop were among the last to go. In 1961, Kleinman finally sold the remaining park property for $50,000. It was turned into an RV campground and remained as such for the next 30 years. There were many reasons contributing to the death of the park that had started in 1891 as a rustic resort. New forms of entertainment, television, rock and roll, another war, this one in Korea, the migration to the suburbs, aging facilities. They all helped put Brady Lake and other parks on the critical list. But the Cleveland Syndicate's almost total focus on gambling took the ultimate toll. They sucked it dry and left it to die. In the end, the mob killed Brady Lake Park.
A curious thing about amusement parks is it's a nearly universal experience. Almost everyone of any age has been to an amusement park.
Old-fashioned amusement parks offered cheap entertainment and thrills and an escape from everyday life. They provided generations of youngsters with happy memories now buried in scrapbooks and home movies. Gone are those smells, sights, and sounds, candy apples, carny barkers, calliopes, kids begging for one more ride. Most of Brady Lake's competitors lasted a little longer than it did, but one by one, they too disappear.
There's not much left of the old park, 60 plus years after it closed. There's a 1930s fire hydrant over there with a tree growing around it. In a jungle of vines and trees and shrubs, there are foundation blocks of the old roller coaster. Down by the lake, still visible, are the concrete platforms of the dining room turned beer garden turned gambling hall. And there's this old picnic pavilion. Try as nature might, it just quite can't get rid of the great old amusement park that entertained generations. Whether it was run by spiritualists, wheeler dealers, or the mob, whether it featured seances or slot machines, this used to be one heck of a place.